In 2024, the film, starring Dong-won Kang, was released. The movie is based on the historical Joseon event known as the Imjin War, telling the story of a Joseon slave struggling to survive in a chaotic world. It explores his desperate attempts to escape his lowly status and his bitter rivalry with a Japanese invader general. Ultimately, it depicts how he rises up against the oppressive and corrupt ruling class. During this time, the great Joseon philosopher Jung Yo-rip dared to proclaim, "All under heaven are equal, whether noble or commoner, born with the same rights." His radical words sent shockwaves through society. When government troops surrounded him, he chose to take his own life. His son was captured, bound, and brought before King Seonjo for a public trial. The king offered him a chance to recant, but everyone in the court knew the man's tongue had already been cut out. Recalling the policy proposed by Jung Yo-rip, King Seonjo ordered his guards to sit on the throne, but they appeared apprehensive. Observing the apprehensive expressions of the entire court, both civil and military officials, King Seonjo turned with satisfaction, watching them prostrate themselves at his feet. Jung Yo-rip's entire family was massacred, heads displayed at the city gates as a warning to the people. Chayon-young's father, unable to repay his debts, had sold his mother into servitude. What he didn't anticipate was that her status as a slave would drag his own son into bondage. Under Joseon law at the time, if either parent was a slave, their children were doomed to the same fate. Chayon-young was then exiled to the residence of a military officer and became a servant to Jong-ryo, the youngest son of the military officer. His role was to take the beatings for his master. Jong-ryo's family had been warriors for generations, and his father pushed him hard, expecting greatness. But because Jong-ryo was of noble blood and destined for a high rank, his body had to remain unscarred. So whenever Jong-ryo faltered in training, the punishment was dealt to Chayon-young instead. When Chayon-young was first brought in, he saw a slave being whipped until he foamed at the mouth, while Jong-ryo sat on the ground watching. Chayon-young had always loved martial arts and was tough. Though the beating brought tears to his eyes, he never made a sound. That night, bruised and battered in bed, he heard sobbing outside. The boy who had been whipped earlier had died, and his parents were consumed by grief and guilt. Chayon-young realized then that he couldn't just wait for death. Jong-ryo, feeling guilty, stole a lot of food from the kitchen and gave it to Chayon-young as compensation. Although Jong-ryo was of noble status, he possessed a kind heart. He even scratched Chayon-young's name into the dirt and told him to be his shadow from then on. However, Chayon-young pried open Jong-ryo's lips, mocking him as a toothless brat. Then he jumped over the high wall in front of Jong-ryo and left. When he returned home, his father was nowhere to be found. After a long search, Chayon-young finally found his father, hanging from a tree in the backyard. Before Chayon-young even had time to grieve, he was captured again. Chayon-young doesn't want to be beaten all the time, so when Jong-ryo is training, he secretly memorizes his teacher's swordsmanship. Late at night, he woke Jong-ryo and showed him how to counter the instructor's moves. The sound of practice startled Jong-ryo's father, who was still handling affairs. Instead of stopping them, he simply watched the two boys train. The next day, with Chayon-young's guidance, Jong-ryo successfully blocked the instructor's attacks, and Chayon-young was spared further punishment. Chayon-young trimmed the cane to make it smoother so it wouldn't hurt as much. At this moment, Jong-ryo came to tell him that his father wanted Chayon-young to be his sparring partner in the future. From that moment on, Chayon-young escaped the fate of being beaten to death. Years passed, and the two boys grew up together, their bond deepening despite their different social stations. But to everyone else in the Lee household, Chayon-young was nothing more than a slave. Jong-ryo's wife even said his life wasn't worth as much as a dog's. These words were heard by Chayon-young outside the door, which made the two brothers feel quite upset, but helpless. Jong-ryo's martial skills had improved, but his indecisive nature kept him from passing the Royal Martial Arts examination. After several failures, Chayon-young knelt down and begged Jong-ryo's father to let him take the exam in Jong-ryo's place. He promised to win first place in exchange for his freedom. Jong-ryo's father, who had spent his entire life focused solely on advancing his family's political career, agreed. Before leaving, Jong-ryo wrapped a red cloth around Chayon-young's hand to hide the slave brand. In return, Chayon-young drew his blade and marked Jong-ryo's hand, binding it with the same red cloth, a silent oath of their brotherhood. Chayon returned victorious, having won the top rank in the exam. He wore the imperial sword and the blue robe of honor, achievements the Lee family had never known. This result made Jongryo's father very happy. Chayon packed his things, ready to leave and make his own way in the world. When Jongryo went to his father to reclaim his close friend's slave contract, his father reneged on his promise. His reason was that if the news of Chayon taking the exam in place of Jongryo was leaked, it would be a crime of deceiving the king, so Chayon had to stay in their house forever. He also knew Chayon would flee upon learning of this, so he had already ordered his thug Guang Yi to be ready to capture him at any time. Chayon seemed to have seen it coming. When Guang Yi burst into the room, he found it empty. Chayon was already gone. Soon Jongryo appeared, and Guang Yi said that he was following orders. Guang Yi moves Jongryo's sword away from him, saying that he will not kill Chayon and leaves. Jongryo spotted Chayon hiding in the shadows. Chayon asked Jongryo if he hadn't gone to his father to get the slave contract. However, the other party handed Chayon the sword bestowed upon him and told him to go as far as possible, as long as he lived. Jongryo told Chayon that if he served the country, he would be freed from slavery. However, things took a turn for the worse. A few days later, Jongryo discovered that Chayon had been captured again. Chayon was extremely furious at that moment, showing no fear of life or death. At Jongryo's persuasion, his father did not kill Chayon directly. However, due to the betrayal from the Lee family, Chayon openly brought up Jongryo's repeated failures in the civil service examinations in front of everyone. He even cursed that Jongryo's entire family would burn to death and vowed to kill his wife. In retaliation, Jongryo ordered his men to subdue Chayon. He then stabbed Tyrin's hand and locked Chayon in a shed. Little did they know that this exchange of harsh words would later become an unbridgeable rift between them. At the same time, Japan had been unified under Toyotomi Hideyoshi and began its aggressive invasions of neighboring territories, including Joseon. The military general Genshin Kikawa led the charge into Joseon. Jongryo urged his family to leave quickly, but when he returned to his room, he discovered that the royal sword he had been granted was missing. The ruler of Joseon, King Seonjo, was a foolish monarch who did not rally his troops to fight back, but instead fled with his family. Throughout their escape, King Seonjo exhibited his usual lavish and decadent demeanor. Jongryo, the martial arts champion, had no choice but to accompany the emperor to protect him. Under such a tyrannical rule, societal divisions were becoming sharper day by day. When the news of an impending conflict reached the oppressed commoners, they immediately resolved to rebel against the nobility that had long exploited them. The steward carelessly picked a servant and began to beat and question him about the whereabouts of the royal sword. At that moment, a man approached the steward with the sword in his hand. He was the father of the child who had been killed earlier. Some workers threw down their iron farming tools and rallied others to rise up against the privileged. The man swiftly killed the steward with a single blow. When the governor returned, he was met only with death. The oppressive Lady Lee could not escape her fate either. The servants burned her to death with the burning indenture, and the fire instantly swept through the entire Lee mansion. In the prison, a dazed Chayon was awoken by the smoke. When he made his way outside, he found the estate in ruins. He pulled the bright red sword from the butler's body and went into the house to retrieve the blue robe that he thought was most valuable. At that moment, only Jongryo's wife and his young son remained in the estate. She saw the bloody sword in Chayon's hand and thought that everything was done by Chayon. She thrust the dagger into Chayon's body, then turned and rushed into the sea of fire with the child in her arms. When Guang Yi returned, the entire Li estate had been turned to ashes. In his daze, a fine horse jumped over the wall and approached him. When he stood up, he found that the person coming was Chayon. Chayon gave a brief glance at Guang Yi, said nothing, and simply rode away. Once outside, he saw that the entire royal city had been engulfed in flames. In that moment, he realized that the world was in chaos. After removing the red band from his hair and wrapping it around the inscription on his wrist, signifying his status as a pariah, Chayon rode towards the palace to investigate. However, because he was holding the imperial sword, he was mistaken for a court official left behind and was therefore detained. The next day, they pulled him in to help organize resistance against the invading Japanese pirates. Although he was a commoner, Chayon's natural talent shone through, having trained in martial arts and academics from a young age alongside the young master. With just a few inspiring words, he rallied the locals who remained amid the turmoil. The hot-blooded hunters and farmers were eager to join the fight. They followed him into the armory, which had been controlled by the nobility, searching for weapons to prepare against the impending incursion. Night soon fell, and the invading Japanese began their brutal assault, sparing no one, including the elderly, women, or children. They plundered goods indiscriminately, even capturing a respected shaman of Joseon. Dressed in red, she vehemently cursed Genshin Kikawa, declaring that he would die by the sword he wielded. Unbeknownst to him, the woman's prophecy would come true. He responded by stabbing her in the throat. However, the advancing Japanese encountered resistance organized by Chayon. The youth skilled in stone throwing drew their attention, leading them into an alley where they faced even more projectile attacks. When they closed the distance, they had to face the shield wall and archers, and the Japanese pirates were forced to retreat step by step. However, the Japanese pirates had muskets in their hands. At the critical moment, Chayon pushed his teammates away and saved their lives. Chayon was keenly aware that the musket had to pause to reload before firing a second time. He advised his allies to take advantage of the opportunity to launch their own attack while he maneuvered around to disrupt the enemy's formation. Upon entering the battlefield, Chayon displayed the true bravery of a martial arts champion, cutting a swath through the Japanese ranks with his sword. Meanwhile, the very forces that should have been facing the Japanese, led by King Seonjo, were fleeing to a nearby ferry to escape and buy themselves some time. King Seonjo was furious at the meal that his servants had worked so hard to prepare. Little did they know that this was a tribute used for sacrifice in a nearby village, and it was also the only fish in the wilderness. His behavior incensed the villagers, who came forth to confront the ridiculous king, vowing to kill him on the spot. Jeon, with his naturally good disposition, felt out of his depth in such a chaotic scene. As a guard, he knew he should be loyal, but King Seonjo's actions were hardly those of a wise ruler. In a moment of despair, he stabbed a charging villager, confusion in his eyes. It wasn't until Gwang Yi rushed in with devastating news that the events shifted. He reported that everyone in the Lee household had fallen victim to Chayon vengeance. There were no survivors. This revelation fundamentally altered Jeongryo's perception of the commoners. No longer hesitating, he ruthlessly began a massacre against the villagers. From that moment, their positions were irreparably opposed. Chayon, a slave fighting to protect the people and defend the nation, stood in stark contrast to Jeongryo, a nobleman who slaughtered countless civilians to protect the corrupt King Seonjo. In the end, Jeongryo, his face smeared with blood, escorted King Seonjo onto a ferry, ensuring his escape. Chayon relentless fighting had caught the attention of Genshin Kikawa, a Japanese commander. Kikawa knew that to defeat the Japanese invaders, he had to eliminate this formidable opponent. After killing a Japanese officer, Chayon approached Genshin Kikawa, holding the enemy's severed head. Genshin Kikawa introduced himself through a translator, but Chayon, being a mere slave, did not bother to introduce himself properly. Without hesitation, the two engaged in combat, fighting fiercely for several rounds without either gaining the upper hand. Chayon even forced Genshin Kikawa to wield dual blades. However, Chayon was already injured and, as a slave, often suffered from hunger, putting him at a significant physical disadvantage compared to the well-nourished warrior Genshin Kikawa. During the fight, Chayon's sword was knocked away, flying toward a cliff behind him. He leaped to catch it, and Genshin Kikawa attempted to strike him down from behind. Chayon managed to counter with a backhand slash, only slicing off one of the ghost horns on Genshin Kikawa's helmet before falling into the river below. Seven years passed, and both sides entered a phase of peace negotiations. In reality, it was the intervention of the Ming Emperor Wanli that drove back the invaders the following year, leading to the peace talks. By then, the Joseon Dynasty was ravaged by famine, with cannibalism becoming a common sight. Despite this, King Seonjo, who had returned to the capital, continued to live in luxury, indifferent to the suffering of his people. He ordered officials to immediately renovate the palace, envisioning grander projects than ever before. His series of reckless actions brought immense suffering to the people. Yongryo had risen to a position of great power, but his eyes were empty. Apart from his desire to avenge his family by killing Chayon, he seemed indifferent to court affairs. Chayon, however, had not perished. Still dressed in his humble blue attire and wielding his sword, he followed a Confucian general who had organized a group of righteous warriors to fight against the Japanese invaders. Over the years, they had been relentless in their resistance. The general, Jeon, though compassionate toward the people, was a proud Confucian scholar. He firmly believed that the current emperor was merely misled by treacherous officials. Boomdong, a capable female leader in the group, suggested that Jeon seize a territory and declare himself king, but Jeon paid no heed to her advice. Chayon, the most skilled warrior among them, also lacked grand ambitions. He simply wanted to follow the general, hoping to one day shed his slave status. This lack of vision puzzled many of his followers who had long lost faith in the corrupt nobility of the dynasty. This internal conflict would soon lead to the disintegration of their organization, culminating in tragedy. Meanwhile, the Japanese warrior Genshin Kikawa had not withdrawn from Joseon after the peace talks. He traveled from place to place, collecting treasures for Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Soon, his small squad encountered an ambush set by Chayon and his comrades. Before they could react, they found themselves completely surrounded. Boomdong, who hated the Japanese pirates, rushed forward and started killing them. As the Japanese tried to flee, they turned to see the very man they feared, Chayon. Genshin Kikawa also recognized Chayon, and once again, the two clashed in battle. Chayon, dodging Genshin Kikawa's attack, used his sword to cut the reins Kikawa was using for leverage, sending him tumbling from his horse. At that moment, Boomdong and the others arrived, capturing Genshin Kikawa in a net. Because of the Japanese invaders' gruesome habit of cutting off noses to count their kills, Genshin Kikawa was mockingly called Nose Devil by the Joseon people. Boomdong suggested executing the prisoners on the spot and using their plundered gold and silver to find a place where they could live in peace. But Jeon insisted on taking Genshin Kikawa and these treasures to the capital to meet the emperor and ask for legitimate honors and salaries for everyone. During the argument, Boomdong, who had long lost faith in the corrupt nobility, stormed off with some of the men. They vented their frustration on a local official who had collaborated with the Japanese, unaware that he was the magistrate of Cheongju, a high-ranking official personally appointed by King Seonjo. This act unwittingly sealed the fate of Jeon and his group. Soon, Jeon and Chayon escorted Genshin Kikawa and the others back to the capital. As true heroes who had fought against the Japanese, they were warmly welcomed by the people. This display of affection made King Seonjo jealous, as the crowd's admiration for them surpassed even his own. Yongryo, standing beside the king, lost his composure upon seeing Chayon on horseback. He whispered to King Seonjo, accusing Jeon of secretly ordering the murder of the magistrate of Cheongju and falsely branding him a traitor. As a result, Jeon and Chayon were separated and ambushed. Although Jeon was a skilled warrior, his loyalty prevented him from fighting back with lethal force. He angrily denounced the crowd's ignorance and demanded an audience with the king, but Yongryo shot the sword from his hand with a musket, leading to his capture. Chayon and the others were lured into an alley and ambushed. Only Chayon, with his superior martial arts, managed to escape. He realized that Guang Yi was behind the ambush. The next day, Jeon and his men were executed on false charges of rebellion. Chayon, who escaped, returned to the dilapidated Li mansion and started a killing spree there. He knew that the person behind the scenes who fanned the flames must be related to Yongryo. Soon, Yongryo, who came after hearing the news, met Chayon here. Neither had expected to meet again under such circumstances. Chayon blamed Yongryo for serving a treacherous king who, like Yongryo's father, rewarded and punished without justice, driving loyal and hardworking men to their doom. Their deep-seated misunderstandings fueled their rage, and they fought fiercely. Chayon, always the better fighter, disarmed Yongryo and pierced his palm with his sword. yet he couldn't bring himself to kill him. During the stalemate, Guang Yi rushed over and shot at Chayon with a musket. Guang Yi eventually died at the hands of Chayon. Chayon did not kill Ryo because he wanted to keep Ryo alive so that he could see how he really planned the rebellion. He took the heads of Jaryong and the others and fled the capital. By the river, he used a heated sword to burn off the tattoo on his hand, symbolizing his complete disillusionment with the world. He no longer hoped for the court's recognition to free himself from his slave status. Then he wrapped everyone's heads with his robe, returned to where Bumdong and the others were, and fainted in front of his brothers. The next day, Bumdong was heartbroken as she buried Jaryong and the others. Though she despised his stubborn loyalty, she respected him as the finest official she had ever known. Meanwhile, in the capital, officials from all over the country petitioned the king to clear Jaryong's name. Widespread uprisings forced King Seonjo to realize that Ryo had distorted the truth out of personal vendetta. Facing punishment, Ryo quickly presented the treasure plundered by Genshin Kikowa to the king. He proposed recruiting the Japanese prisoners to search for a hidden treasure, which could be sold to the Ming Dynasty to fund the palace's reconstruction. King Seonjo agreed and, despite opposition from his officials, allowed Ryo to lead the Japanese prisoners on this quest. On the other side, Chayon, now recovered from his wounds, had finally abandoned all hope in the court. He decided to rise in rebellion, but their group was now reduced to fewer than 30 men. To recruit more soldiers, Chayon and his group sought the treasure mentioned by the Japanese invaders. They found the vast wealth just before Ryo and his men arrived. However, most of these people were poor commoners with no grand ambitions. Without a core leader like Jaryong, they only wanted to live a peaceful life. They tied Chayon and Bumdong to a tree and left happily with the gold and silver. Only the youngest among them was heartbroken. He had no greed for money but was deeply concerned about Chayon, who had been abandoned. The strategist, seeing his distress, asked if he truly wanted to give up wealth and return to fight alongside Chayon. Upon receiving an affirmative answer, he decided to let him go. Unbeknownst to him, this decision saved his life, as Ryo and his men were on their way from the capital to find the treasure. When the three arrived, they found only a scene of slaughter. Furious, Chayon decided to pursue and fight to the death. They followed the trail to a beach where they found Ryo's men and the Japanese invaders divided into two opposing factions. Surprisingly, the Japanese, surrounded by muskets, showed no sign of panic. When they opened fire on the Japanese pirates, everyone's gun exploded. This was because the Japanese pirates had been maintaining these guns, and if the barrels were blocked, they would explode. Realizing he had been outmaneuvered, Ryo, enraged, led his remaining men into battle with the Japanese. Genshin Kikowa, confident in his plan, intended to kill Ryo and his men, take the treasure, and return by ship to complete his mission. At this moment, thick fog suddenly rose up, and Ryo, who was red-eyed with anger, finally came in front of Genshin Kikowa, ready to fight him to the death. Genshin Kikowa not only wanted the treasure, but also planned to use Ryo as a bargaining chip to exchange for captured Japanese soldiers during the peace talks. This made Ryo very angry and he rushed forward to fight with Genshin Kikowa. Soon, Chayon arrived and launched a fierce attack on Ryo. Genshin Kikowa, a Japanese pirate, looked at the two people fighting with confusion. Genshin Kikowa told Chayon that he was going to keep Ryo alive and asked him to show mercy, but Chayon had no intention of sparing anyone, and the three engaged in a fierce battle. Meanwhile, Bumdong arrived with her men. After one of her younger brothers was slashed across the face, Bumdong, having lost many comrades, unleashed her full strength, overwhelming the Japanese. Ryo, in the midst of the battle, furiously questioned his old friend about why he had heartlessly killed his family. At that moment, Chayon finally understood the reason behind Ryo's drastic change in character. Chayon raised his hand and Ryo stabbed it with his sword. Chayon then painfully explained the truth to Ryo. Realizing the years of misunderstanding that had led him astray, Ryo was stunned. When he saw Chayon injured by Genshin Kikowa, he finally unleashed his full fighting spirit. Ryo fiercely blocked Genshin Kikowa, who was about to deliver a fatal blow to Chayon, bursting with immense will to fight. However, Genshin Kikuwa, clad in armor, deflected all his attacks and launched a frenzied counterattack with his dual blades. Seeing Jeongryo's tragic death, Chayon, ignoring the pain in his hand, launched an attack. He picked up Jeongryo's sword, combined with the broken blade in his left hand, and also used the double sword style to continue fighting with Genshin Kikuwa. After blocking a lethal strike with the sword's hilt, Chayon swiftly severed Genshin Kikuwa's left arm. But the severed arm still clung tightly to the sword's hilt, so Chayon cut off Genshin Kikuwa's other arm. Then, with that same sword, he pierced the Japanese warrior's throat, fulfilling the prophecy once made by the shaman. Later, in the royal court of the capital, King Seonjo finally received news of the treasure he had sent Jeongryo to find. Overjoyed, he believed his long-awaited grand palace would soon be rebuilt. However, when he ordered the heavy chests to be opened, they were filled with Japanese noses preserved in sea salt, horrifying the emperor. Meanwhile, the real treasure had already been used by Chayon and his followers to secretly organize a rebellion, and their forces were now stirring near the capital, ready to rise.